Once again, welcome back to Short Story Theatre. This is your host Basil Nightingale with a question. Do you know who said, "Inspiration is the mother and the father of all innovations and human progress"? It was I. I just said it. But somebody else probably said it before I did. The point is, that we all have some unique talent that is hidden deep inside. If we are lucky, that hidden inspiration is nurtured by a parent, or by a very special teacher, like Mr. Pepper who taught grade 6 in northern Maine. This is his story, written especially for Short Story Theatre by our producer Bill Russo, who also serves as your narrator for today's tale. Now here's Bill.
Mr. Pepper, who taught the 6th grade at Bells Neck Elementary School, was just about the best teacher there ever was. Everybody said so. Not just the 24 students in his current class, or the more than 300 students he had during the previous 15 school years. Everybody, even the principal, all the parents, all other teachers, they all agreed there was nobody like good old Mr. Pepper. He wasn't really that seasoned. He was barely past 40. But to 11-year-olds in the last year of grade school, whose parents are barely 30, the gray-haired, ever-smiling Mr. Pepper seemed like a wrinkled and ancient but wonderful treasure. Even 216 miles away from Bells Neck, all the way down to Bangor, folks knew about Mr. Pepper. They learned of him from former students who quoted Pepper like some folks invoked the name of Shakespeare or Bob Dylan. What made him so special? Animation! Animation! That's what Mrs. Hardy said. Mrs. Hardy was the nurse for the Bells Neck educational system, which consisted of a single building with a half-dozen classrooms, one each for grades 1 through 6. From grade 7 on, local pupils were driven by bus to either the regional high school or the regional junior high school in Fort Kent, about a 40-minute drive each way on the Pine Tree State Highway. Animation was the key to his success, Mrs. Hardy said. Animation. He did not teach his subjects, he lived them. When discussing American history, he was likely to be dressed as President George Washington, or as Miles Standish, the hired gun for the settlers of the Plymouth colony of 1620. When describing the great Chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag tribe, who rescued the Europeans from starvation that first winter, he was garbed in Native American gear, from the soft moccasins on his feet to a great colorful feather headdress that trailed down almost to the floor. He taught arithmetic with the use of Necco wafers, that candy made up in Boston, some 500 miles from his schoolhouse. Most teachers consider mathematics an abstract science, and they teach it just as gloomily as if it were. But in Mr. Pepper's class, pupils with hands thrust into sanitary plastic gloves learned to multiply 2 Necco wafers 5 times. And end up with a nice little snack of 10 colorful little edible discs. Or perhaps they learned how to divide a whole roll of Necco wafers by 24. The answer to that sweet little problem is 2. Speaking of roll, that's how reading was taught, by roll, not by rote. Little plays were staged, and each student in turn was an actor, given a role in the performance. The productions were intended to be impromptu in class, but the pupils were so eager to do well, that without being told to, they spent many hours at home practicing the reading of their parts. There never was a bad kid in any class taught by Mr. Pepper. That was attested to by the accomplishments of the people from his first years of teaching, who were already making their mark in Maine and all around the country as solid, hard-working, good citizens. But there was trouble in his 16th year of teaching. It looked like Mr. Pepper's world was crashing down. His students, every single boy, and each little girl were failing. Usually everybody in class got at least a score of 85 on every test. Yet for over a month now, these same children were getting failing grades. They scored lower than 50 on every single exam. Mr. Pepper knew that he had not changed, but his students had. He discussed the problem with Mr. Heifetz. Mr. Heifetz was the long-tenured principal. Mr. Heifetz spoke with the students who claimed that they were trying just as hard as ever, trying their best, but they just couldn't understand the subjects that were being taught. They said they were unable to pass their tests and probably should have to repeat the 6th grade again next year. In desperation, Mr. Heifetz and Mr. Pepper went to the smartest person they both knew, which was Mrs. Hardy, the school nurse. She was aware of the problem, but didn't think it was her place to give any advice unless asked to do so. Huddled in the tiny office of the principal with Mr. Heifetz and Mr. Pepper, she spoke softly and said with the greatest of respect,
"I think I know what the problem is. If I may, I believe I can explain it by giving you an example."
By all means, Mrs. Hardy. Please go ahead. Both Mr. Pepper and myself have the utmost confidence in your advice.
Thank you, Mr. Heifetz. I think we can fix the problem, but first let me tell you a story about a little robin I found in my backyard a few years back. It was a baby bird that had tumbled from its nest. As I was tending my garden, I spotted the poor little thing. It was far too young to fly, and its parents were trying to guard it, feed it, and keep it safe from wandering raccoons, cats, or anything else that would try to make it a meal. I watched the bird for weeks, and tried to help its parents by setting out water and bits of food. A month went by, and the other baby birds, the ones in the nest, took quick test flights, and then soared off, to make their own way in the world. But try as it might, the little bird on the ground could not fly. Its broken wing never healed properly. The parents stayed with it for a few days, but eventually had to fly away to build a new nest. I brought the bird into my barn and kept it there all winter long, trying my best to heal it, and let it grow up. By the next spring, it had learned to fly and regularly perched upon the ceiling beams of my barn. When the warm weather came, I pushed the little robin from the barn and it flew up into a maple tree. I waited for it to fly away, but it stayed in the tree for no more than 5 minutes before flying back into the barn. Over the next 5 days I tried to get the robin to go out on its own, but it remained in the barn and refused to go outside. Finally I got an idea. I gathered up the best bird treats I could find, and spread them around my garden. Soon there were more than a dozen red robins, bobbing among my tomato plants, and rows of snap beans. The barn door was wide open, so my robin could see what was happening. That first day, it stayed in the barn. I didn't put any food down for it inside the barn, so by the second day, it was very hungry. Once again I spread a bird buffet, among my tomato plants and the vines of green beans. A new flock of robins soon appeared, and shortly afterwards my little robin flew out and joined them. After the food was gone, the flock flew off towards Long Lake, and to my joy I saw that my little bird was with them. I kept feeding the robins all summer long, and I'm pretty sure that my little pal stayed with them. In the fall they gathered on the telephone lines in the street by the hundreds, covering the phone lines like so many ants at a picnic. By the end of October, they all flew away. Next stop, The South. With my broken-winged little buddy, happily soaring along with them.
Well, Mrs. Hardy, I appreciate your kindness in saving that little bird, but I don't see how it relates to our current problem.
The little robin was comfortable in my barn. It was a safe haven for it. The outside world seemed far too big and scary for it. But after it saw the other robins and mingled with them, it realized that it belonged with the flock. Mr. Pepper, your students are not much different from that little bird. You're simply too good of a teacher, Mr. Pepper. These kids love you, and feel very comfortable in your class. Next year, they will have to go to school in Fort Kent. A lot of these children are farm kids. They've never been more than 5 or 10 miles away from Bell's Neck. But at the end of this summer, they are going to have to board a big yellow bus, and spend 80 minutes a day going back and forth, to and from Fort Kent, in a huge new school with kids from 4 or 5 other towns. They are frightened, so they are failing school on purpose, in hopes of spending another year in Bell's Neck with their favorite teacher, Mr. Pepper.
Thinking it over, Mr. Pepper decided Mrs. Hardy was right, but he was not going to change his ways. He would not become a bad guy just to push kids along to junior high school. There had to be another way. Field trip. That's it. If he could show the kids what was ahead for them, he could get them to want to fly away to the next stop in their life. So he went to Mr. Heifetz and explained that he wanted to take the whole class to the regional junior high school for a whole day. The following week, with Mr. Heifetz himself driving the school bus, and Mrs. Hardy, the school nurse, along to help out, Mr. Pepper and his 24 students made their way along the bumpy county road until it joined up with the Pine Tree State Highway, heading towards Fort Kent Regional Junior High School. The principal and his staff at FK Junior rolled out the red carpet for the Bell's Neck kids. They were shown the wood shop, the metal shop, the cooperative farming operation, which had 2 cultivated fields and 3 greenhouses in which students grew flowers or vegetables or a mixture of both. They saw the chemistry lab with beakers of boiling liquids, the gymnasium with real hoops instead of peach baskets. They saw the quarter-mile outdoor track with its running surface of actual cinders, the baseball field. And best of all, the brightly lit cafeteria. That cafeteria was the biggest treat of the whole day, where for 25 cents, which was supplied by Mr. Pepper, the students had a delightful lunch consisting of a slice of hot pepperoni pizza, a garden salad, French fries made with Maine potatoes, a carton of milk, and for dessert, a hot brownie with a scoop of vanilla ice cream on top. After a day of wonders and excitement, the students piled back into the old bus, tired but happy. Mr. Heifetz started up the big yellow bus and pointed it in the direction of Bell's Neck. On the way back home, one at a time, each of the 24 students in his class came up to Mr. Pepper and promised to study very hard. And they promised that they'd get passing grades so that they would be able to attend FK Regional Junior High School next year. True to their word, the pupils regained their smarts. All of them got back to being A students. At graduation day, they bid Mr. Pepper a tearful goodbye, but they said they couldn't wait for summer to be over so that they could start 7th grade in Fort Kent. Mr. Pepper told them, "Listen, guys, don't wish the summer away. Enjoy it. Enjoy each part of your life for what it is. Never wish away even a single day. Life is an adventure, but you only get one chance at it, so do it right. And so his class left him, as had 15 other classes before. Altogether, he had taught 16 different groups of his kids. 16 different groups of his kids. That's how he thought of them, his kids. He remembered every single one of them. Now you might ask, how could he do so? Yearbooks. Belzec was a small town, and it really didn't have much to be proud of. It was a poor community, made up mostly of farm workers and workers at the paper mill. They were hard-working people, but there wasn't a lot of extra money floating around. And yet, the town always found the resources to buy the yearbooks. Every June, a new issue of the Belzec Elementary School yearbook was issued to each pupil free of charge. Inside were pictures of all the students, as well as the principal, Mr. Highfitz, the nurse, Mrs. Hardy, and all 6 teachers, including Mr. Pepper. So Mr. Pepper's latest yearbook was his 16th, and all during the summer he read and reread every single one of those yearbooks. He looked at the pictures, he read the descriptions under the pictures, and remembered every student. He recalled any special skills or talent that they might have displayed. And every day he read the county newspaper, as well as the newspapers from Bangor, the Bangor Daily News, the Boston Globe, and even the New York Times. He searched through those papers for any mention of his kids. Every so often there'd be an article about one of them, and he clipped the item from the paper and pasted it into a scrapbook. Some of his students went directly into the military after graduation from the regional high school. Jimmy Daigle, Ronnie Santamont, Freddie Barton, they all won Silver Stars. Mary Green, Tim Ranger, and Joey LaFlame, they all were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Some of Mr. Pepper's pupils became politicians. There was a mayor or two, several city councilors, and even a couple members of the United States Congress. Yes, Mr. Pepper knew each and every student. He still knew their names, going back all 16 years, and all 325 of them. Mr. Pepper had a 17th yearbook. It was not from Belzec, Maine, but from a tiny town on Cape Cod, also called Belzec, where he too had to leave the 6th grade to attend a regional high school far away from his home. He stared at his picture from more than 20 years ago in the Cape Cod yearbook, and even now it hurt to gaze at it. He looked far younger back then than the other boys. His unruly curls shot out in all directions like 4th of July fireworks. There had never been a comb invented that could train the haystack on top of his head, nor had any gel ever been strong enough to hold his wild hairs in formation. Being the smallest boy in his class, he was picked on, bullied, and made fun of. His dark curly hair was derided by the kids, and his name, Pepperoncini, that name, Pepperoncini, made him a laughingstock. As bad as school was for him in the 6th grade at Belzec on Cape Cod, he still dreaded the next school year, which would be spent far away in the Barnstable Regional Junior High School. which served 10 villages and towns all throughout the middle of Cape Cod. But that next year, for little Mr. Peperoncini, something changed. From the very first day in the new school, everything was different. It was Mrs. Clough, who did it. She was his English teacher, and from the start, she treated everyone special. She called him Mr. Pepper instead of Peperoncini, and the other kids thought it was cool, so they started calling him Mr. Pepper. As for his curly hair, there were dozens of kids with curly hair in the regional school, though he had been the only one in Bell's Neck with curly hair. A couple of the curly-haired boys were stars on the football team, and they adopted Mr. Pepper as one of their own. Freed from being stomped on and picked on and treated like dirt, young Mr. Pepper developed physically and mentally at the regional school. He became a very good student and one of Mrs. Clough's greatest success stories. It was she who guided him through junior high school and later through high school when she became the principal of the Barnstable Regional High School. It was Mrs. Clough who helped him get a scholarship to the Salem Normal School for Teachers. That school later became Salem State University. He kept in touch with Mrs. Clough all through college and during his years teaching in Bell's Neck in Maine. It was Mrs. Clough who taught him how to use animation in his classroom, just as she had used it in her classroom. Everyone who ever saw her will never forget Mrs. Clough's teachings of Florence Nightingale as she dressed in the uniform of the Lady of the Lamp, who braved shot and shell in the Crimean War as she ran from foxhole to foxhole in the darkness of night to treat wounded soldiers. Mrs. Clough passed away 3 years ago. To the end, she and Mr. Pepper communicated regularly by telephone and by letters, and more recently by emails or text messages or Facebook. Her last words to Mr. Peperoncini, now known as Mr. Pepper, were, "Pass it on, Mr. Pepper, pass it on, Mr. Pepper, pass it on, Mr. Pepper. Make sure there is at least one of us who will keep the tradition alive." Mr. Pepper had been searching for someone who could bear the torch that he had carried for 16 years, and the torch that Mrs. Clough had borne for 40 years. But so far, although he had more than 300 excellent students, he had not found the one special person who could be the next Mrs. Clough or the next Mr. Pepper. But the new school year starts soon, and perhaps this will finally be the year he discovers that special student. And when he does, he will help in obtaining a scholarship. Just like Mrs. Clough did for him, he will kick in as much of his own money as is needed to keep the line moving, keep the line moving, keep the line moving. In the meantime, he must press his George Washington suit, get that suit pressed, and powder his wig. Oh, and his stovepipe hat and fake Lincoln beard, they need some attention too. And a couple of feathers have fallen out of his Massasoit headdress. So many things to do during the summer, so many things to do, and it goes by so fast. Soon, it will be the start of a new school year.
And so closes Mr. Pepper's Grade 6 class. Written especially for Short Story Theatre by our producer, Bill Russo. If you know a Mr. Pepper, or a Mrs. Clough, you are very lucky. When next you see your Mrs. Clough, or your Mr. Pepper, be sure to let them know that you appreciate them. The world needs more folks just like them. That's all for now. If you liked the story, do us a favor and share it, or like it on Facebook. Help us spread the word. Goodbye for now. Please come back again real soon. Won't you?